Snow had stopped falling an hour earlier, leaving the air in Silver Ridge County strangely hollow, as if the entire valley were holding its breath. Dawn was still a rumor behind the mountains, nothing more than a faint silver seam above the tree line. The county building sat quiet at this hour, its windows dark except for a single room deep inside, where a soft flicker of motion broke the stillness. Detective Elise Warren paused at the door, listening to the low hum of machines echoing through the deserted hallway. She had spent months searching for momentum, a case that had resisted every kind of pressure. Yet something about tonight felt different, as if the silence itself had shifted, loosening its grip on the story that had defined this town's darkest myth. Inside, the forensic lab glowed with cold blue light. Dr. Kira Rand stood near the evidence table, shoulders slightly tense, her eyes fixed on a digital display that pulsed gently in the dimness. No words were exchanged at first. Elise stepped forward, drawn by a quiet certainty she couldn't name. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old leather. On the table, beneath a clear shell of polymer glass, lay the object that had consumed the last 2 weeks of their work. A red winter boot, cracked and faded, its laces stiff and knotted with the stubbornness of age. It looked impossibly small in the sterile glow, like something recovered from a place where time had curled in on itself. Kira finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's ready." Elise felt her pulse move faster, a steady thud rising through the quiet. "Show me." Kira tapped the screen, bringing forward a series of numbers, each one fragile, incomplete, and yet unmistakably real. Elise recognized the pattern before Kira even finished explaining. The fragments lined up like constellations she had been staring at through fog for months. A partial genetic signature, faint but viable, assembled from residues deep inside the lace channel places no one had tested before, because in 1984, those methods didn't exist. But now they did. And the boot, silent for nearly 4 decades, had finally spoken. "It's male," Kira said. The tremor beneath her words wasn't fear or excitement. It was reverence, the kind reserved for discoveries that change the shape of a story. "And the markers are strong enough for a genealogical upload." Elise let her gaze shift back to the boot. She imagined where it had been that night, how it had moved across a wooden floor, how it had been left behind when everything else was taken. The red leather seemed darker under the lab lights, as if it held the shadow of whoever touched it last. "How soon?" Elise asked. "Within the hour. Once the system maps it, we follow the branches." Kira paused. "This could be the moment we've been waiting for." Elise nodded slowly. She felt the weight of the town outside, the years of whispered theories, vigil lanterns, and the quiet grief of a man who grew old wondering what happened to his sister. She thought of Daniel Rowan standing every spring beside the forest road where the cabin once stood, letting the wind carry his questions into the trees. She stepped closer, her breath leaving a faint cloud in the cold room. "Start it." Kira confirmed the chain of custody one more time, her fingers precise, steady. The machine accepted the data, lights chasing one another across the interface as the algorithm began its long, meticulous process. Hours of waiting condensed into a single soundless moment. The lab felt smaller, as if the walls leaned in to listen. The first match appeared, weak but recognizable, a distant cousin. Then another, closer. The branches of the family tree began to thicken, pulling threads together from towns scattered across Montana and beyond. Kira inhaled sharply. There, that cluster. A name surfaced on the screen. Not the full identity, not yet. Just the beginning of a lineage that would narrow itself with every additional marker. A family that once lived along the same logging road where the Rowan cabin had stood. A surname that had drifted in and out of the original files like a ghost too faint to hold. Elise stared at it, saying nothing. The cold air pressed closer. The truth wasn't clear, not yet, but it was moving slow, deliberate, like something waking after a long winter. "This is real," Kira murmured. "After all these years." "It's finally real." Elise didn't answer. She felt the story turning beneath her feet, the silent years beginning to crack. She thought of the boot again, that single object left behind in a night of violence and disappearance. The years had not erased what it carried. They had only hidden it. Outside, the first hint of daylight touched the snow, soft and uncertain. The valley remained silent, but not the same silence as before. This one carried a tremor, a new pulse, a shift too subtle for anyone on the streets to notice, but not for Elise. She knew a door had opened. And once opened, there was no closing it again. She looked again at the name flickering on the screen, a whisper from a life that never intended to be found. To understand how this began, we go back to 1984. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe now. It helps us bring more truth to light. On most mornings in the spring of 1984, the Rowan cabin stirred long before the sun reached the valley floor. The house was small enough that every movement felt shared. The sound of a kettle or the click of a bedroom door traveling easily through the wooden walls. Mara Rowan often woke first. She had grown into the kind of 13-year-old who needed the quiet minutes at the edge of the day, when the rest of the world still felt half-dreamed. She liked the stillness, the way the forest outside seemed suspended between darkness and first light. She kept her sketchbook under her pillow, and most mornings she would slide it out carefully so as not to wake her younger brother. The top page, stained slightly where she had erased too enthusiastically, showed the outline of a pine branch she hadn't quite perfected. She added a few more strokes, studying the way the weak light traced the edges of the trees outside her window. By the time she reached the kitchen, the kettle was just beginning to hiss. Her mother smiled at her with a mixture of fatigue and affection. Life had not been easy for the Rowans, especially since her father's logging hours had been cut again. But in the mornings the house felt warm, the kind of warmth created not by money, but by routine and presence. "You're up early," her mother said. "I wanted to finish my drawing." Mara set the sketchbook on the table and pulled her red winter boots from beside the door. They were battered, the leather wearing thin where her feet bent as she walked, but she loved them. They had been a gift from her grandmother the previous Christmas, one of the last gifts she remembered receiving before everything began to stretch thin for the family. She wore them even when the weather didn't call for it. They made her feel grounded, as if each step left a mark she could follow back home. Her brother, Daniel, shuffled into the kitchen, hair sticking up, face creased with pillow lines. Mara pulled the red boot toward her. "Want to see my new sketch?" she asked him. He nodded through a yawn. She flipped the book around, and he studied the page with the seriousness only an 8-year-old could muster. "Looks like Dad's pine," he said. "The one near the road. That's what I was going for." Her father emerged a few minutes later, smelling faintly of pine sap and cold air. He pressed a hand gently to Mara's head in greeting, then reached for the mug her mother always set out for him. He looked tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from wondering how many more weeks the mill could keep him on. Still, he made room for optimism every morning. He asked his daughter about school, about her art class, about whether she planned to join the end-of-year competition. She shrugged, shy even with her own family. "You're good enough," he told her. "You should show people." She didn't answer, but she held the sketchbook tighter. The bus stop was a simple clearing off the logging road, the gravel patched with long puddles from melting snow. Mara always arrived a few minutes early, giving herself time to listen to the wind stirring between the trees. Her boots splashed quietly as she walked, each step leaving a recognizable print she later liked to trace on the walk back home. Daniel often tried to step exactly where she had stepped, turning the path into a sort of game. School in Pine Hollow followed predictable rhythms. Her classmates were children of loggers, mill workers, and forest rangers. Everyone knew everyone. Even the new student who had transferred in October was no longer new. Teachers remembered siblings and cousins, and the stories that moved between families. Mara moved through the hallways quietly, never quite invisible but never seeking attention either. She excelled in art, Not because she spoke about it or showed her work proudly, but because she was meticulous, patient, and able to see details others overlooked. Her teacher, Ms. Hendley, often stopped by Mara's desk to watch her draw. "You're telling stories with those lines," she once said. "Don't hide them." Mara wasn't sure what to do with praise. She looked down at her worn red boots and said nothing. Lunchtime was her favorite break. She usually sat under the window near the radiator, sketchbook open, while she ate. She drew pieces of the world that held her attention: the shape of tree rings, the arc of a raven's wing, the long shadows that stretched across the snow. Sometimes she doodled her brother's face, exaggerating his eyebrows until she laughed quietly to herself. Most afternoons she walked home with Daniel. The siblings shared a closeness born from long winters spent indoors and summers spent climbing rocks near the creek. She talked to him in the kind of way older sisters often do, with gentle teasing and unspoken protectiveness. He confided in her easily, trusting her with small secrets that seemed enormous to a child. One of the last ordinary afternoons they shared came about a week before everything changed. The snow had started melting, leaving soft patches of earth exposed. Mara walked a little ahead, her red boots making distinct impressions in the slush. "You always walk so fast," Daniel complained. "You gotta keep up," she said, grinning. He hopped from print to print behind her, stretching his stride. "Why do you always wear those boots?" he asked. "They make me feel like I can find my way," she said. "Even if I get lost, I'd know the steps I took." Then she tapped her heel lightly. "And they're red. Who doesn't like red?" She didn't know he would remember those words for the rest of his life. At home, the family settled into familiar evening routines. Dinner was simple but shared. Homework spread across the kitchen table. Their father told stories from the mill, small things, like someone winning a card game during break, or how the foreman had slipped and ruined a sandwich. Laughter echoed through the cabin, softening the hardness the adults tried to carry in silence. Mara kept drawing between conversations. Her mother had tried to encourage her to switch to painting, saying she had an eye for color, but Mara preferred the precision of pencil. The red boots rested near her chair, leaving a faint line of melted snow across the floorboards. When bedtime arrived, she allowed Daniel to fall asleep in her room, something he asked for now and then. She read him a few pages from a book they shared, her voice soft, steady, familiar. She drifted off herself eventually, sketchbook still open beside her hand. The last day before everything changed began as quietly as any other. The air was warmer, carrying the scent of wet earth. A raven perched near the cabin door, watching as Mara tied her red boots and brushed mud from the toes. Breakfast was uneventful. There was talk about needing to stack more firewood, about the weather warming earlier than expected. Daniel teased Mara about the scarf she wore, calling it Old Lady Gray. She rolled her eyes but smiled. At school, she gave her art teacher a drawing she had worked on secretly, a cluster of pines with a single beam of sunlight breaking through. Miss Hendley blinked in surprise and told her it was the most thoughtful thing a student had ever given her. The teacher didn't know it would become the last piece Mara ever finished. The walk home that evening felt unusually calm. No wind, no bird calls, just the soft rhythm of water dripping from branches. Mara paused near the bend in the road, tugging at her bootlace, which had loosened. She tightened it with a firm pull, unaware that this simple movement would become a detail investigators returned to decades later, searching for meaning in the ordinary. Daniel ran ahead, laughing, carrying a stick he pretended was a sword. She watched him, felt a brief warmth spread through her chest, then continued walking. That night, the Rowan cabin glowed faintly through the trees, a soft island of light in a landscape already sinking into darkness. Inside, Mara laid out her sketchbook, intending to start a new drawing. She never got the chance. This was the last evening her world remained whole. The night of April 12, 1984, did not arrive with warning. It drifted into Pine Hollow quietly, settling over the valley with the kind of stillness that made even the trees seem cautious. By early evening, the melting snow had hardened again, forming thin icy skins over mud puddles along the logging road. The Rowan cabin glowed softly through the thinning mist, its windows small squares of yellow in a landscape turning blue with night. Inside the cabin, the family fell into their usual rhythms. Their father had returned late from the mill, carrying the smell of wet bark on his jacket. The children ate quickly, laughing when Daniel knocked over his cup and Mara teased him for being clumsy. The red boots rested near her chair, carrying specks of slush that melted into the hardwood. She had planned to sketch before bed, but had left the book closed when her brother asked her to read to him instead. At 8:37 p.m., according to the clock later photographed by investigators, the cabin settled into its nighttime hush. The wood stove crackled. Outside, the wind dipped for the first time in hours. The entire forest seemed to inhale. No one could say when the first sound broke the calm, but some believed it came from the road, a vehicle grinding over frozen gravel. The Rowan cabin sat a few hundred feet off the main path, and although the family had grown used to the occasional late-night hunter or mill worker passing through, the sound did not fade like the others. It approached slowly, deliberately, as if the engine was being kept purposely quiet. At some point between 8:45 and 9 p.m., the headlights swept faintly across the tree line near the cabin. The family inside did not appear to notice. The timeline that followed was painstakingly reconstructed from small clues: the angle of a fallen lamp, the position of overturned chairs, the way a curtain had been torn from its rod. Investigators believed the cabin door was forced open, no sign of lock tampering, but the wood around the latch had splintered under sudden pressure. The room showed signs of confusion rather than immediate violence, as though the attackers spoke first, their words startling, chaotic, unfamiliar. Mara's sketchbook was found on the floor, a page bookmarked by a fallen pencil. The pencil tip had snapped. What happened inside the cabin could not be fully reconstructed. The original investigators lacked the training and tools that would later become standard. But the positions of bodies, the pattern of bruising, and the battered furniture suggested a struggle that had erupted quickly and without any chance for escape. In the main room, 2 members of the Rowan family were found near the overturned dining table. A third lay closer to the wood stove. The small wooden box that held the family's spare keys was open, its contents scattered. There were 2 sets of adult shoe prints documented at the time, though they were photographed poorly under dim lighting. Some impressions led toward the back window of the cabin. The glass pane there was cracked inward, as if someone had braced a hand on it or tried to climb through. The partial smudge on the frame, discovered years later in archived photos, hinted at gloved or sweat-smeared contact, but no definitive prints were saved. Outside, the snow had a thin crust that broke under pressure. One trail of footprints moved around the side of the cabin. A second set moved erratically, fading into the deeper shadows of the tree line. Investigators believed these belonged to a child being carried. The spacing and angle suggested uneven weight, one adult bringing someone small and limp against their chest. Within this chaos, one detail stood out, one that would haunt the case for decades. Near the back of the cabin, resting on its side in a muddy smear, lay a red winter boot. Only one, the right boot. Its laces stretched tight, the knot pulled with unusual force. The matching left boot was nowhere to be found. It was positioned near the cracked window, almost as if Mara had lost it mid-struggle, or had been pulled through the frame with such urgency that it tore from her foot. But the exact reason remained unclear. The angle of the boot, the direction of the smear, the drag marks, all hinted at movement, but not motive. It became the first major clue and the first major mystery. No neighbors saw anything directly, but at 9:27 p.m., a woman who lived farther up the road reported hearing a brief commotion carried faintly through the trees. She dismissed it as animals or the distant sound of wood splitting before a storm, unaware of what was happening below. The next morning began like any other in Pine Hollow, with the mill siren sounding just after dawn. Frost clung to the edges of the logging road. A forest ranger driving toward a trailhead noticed the Rowan cabin door ajar. That in itself was not unusual. Families often let the breeze circulate in warmer months. But the ranger, a man named Alan Grant, felt something tighten in his chest as he passed. Maybe it was the unnatural angle of the door, or the stillness inside, or the absence of movement where there was usually the morning shuffle of a family preparing for school. He turned around, parking his truck near the tree stump the Rowans used as a bench. The cabin's silence felt wrong, not the sleepy quiet of early morning, but a deeper stillness like a void pressed against the walls. Grant knocked lightly and called out, "No answer." He stepped inside. The air carried a faint metallic scent beneath the lingering smell of wood smoke. Papers lay scattered across the floor. A chair had been snapped in half, one leg splintered. Drawers were open, the contents displaced. He took a step back, realizing with sudden clarity that this was not a scene meant to be walked into casually. He left immediately, retreating to his truck and radioing the sheriff's office. The dispatcher's voice sharpened as Grant described what he had seen. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later. They moved cautiously through the cabin, stepping around the damaged furniture, calling out names they knew well. Rowan, Rowan. The shape of the tragedy became clear in the span of moments. What remained inside the cabin was devastating, but one question struck harder than the others. Where was Mara? Her bed was untouched. Her sweater hung from a chair. Her sketchbook lay open on the floor, displaying the outline of a pine tree she had drawn days earlier. But the absence of the left boot confirmed what the deputies feared: the girl had been taken. The red boot found near the back window became the center of their early investigation. It was photographed multiple times, bagged and mislabeled before being sorted again. The chain of custody, in those first unstable hours, suffered errors that would haunt the case. Fibers were lost. The boot was handled without proper gloves by at least one deputy. Even so, some traces remained deep within its structure, unnoticed for years. The sheriff at the time, Henry Lowell, tried to piece together the night. He traced the footprints around the cabin, though portions were already melting under the rising sun. The trail that seemed to belong to Mara ended abruptly near the tree line, merging into larger impressions that led toward the road. Some reports suggested a second individual had waited there. Others believed the abduction was planned by someone who knew the cabin well. Inside the cabin, Lowell noticed something peculiar among the chaos. The curtain rod near the back window had snapped, but only on one side. The curtain dangled unevenly, half torn, as if someone had been pulled through quickly and caught the fabric in the process. A corner of the cloth was missing, a ragged shape torn free. Months later, a matching fragment would be found outside near the creek, weathered and nearly colorless. Early investigators failed to connect the two pieces. Another unresolved detail came from the kitchen table. A ceramic mug had been set down with enough force to chip the rim. Inside the mug was a faint trace of something dark. Whether it was coffee or something else was never determined. Samples that could have clarified the detail were discarded accidentally during the first week of investigation. The final strange clue came from the far edge of the yard. A single scrap of rope lay half buried in the mud, frayed on both ends. The rope matched nothing in the Rowans' belongings. It seemed too thin for logging, too clean for long-term outdoor use. Its origins would remain uncertain until decades later, when investigators re-examined the earlier photos and noticed a faint impression of similar rope on the windowsill inside the cabin. By midday, the Rowan cabin had filled with deputies, reporters, and concerned townspeople. Rumors spread quickly in Pine Hollow. Some claimed to have seen the suspicious truck earlier that week. Others whispered names of men who had left town suddenly or who had argued with the Rowan father at the mill. Theories multiplied faster than evidence. By early afternoon, the cabin was sealed. The Rowan family's relatives collected what personal items they could bear to take. Mara's boots, the surviving left one missing, remained the central object around which grief and confusion gathered. But even amid the shock, one detail stood apart, lodged in the mind of everyone who stepped through the crime scene that day. It was not the broken furniture or the footprints or the torn curtain. It was the position of the red boot, angled slightly toward the window, resting on its side, laces drawn tight, as if it had been waiting to be found. And though no one understood it at the time, the boot held its truth quietly, tucked deep within its worn eyelets, waiting for a future that had not yet arrived. That unresolved angle, that unexplainable placement, remained the odd detail investigators could never fully account for. In the weeks after the Rowan murders, the investigation moved with a frantic energy that made it seem, at first, like answers were only days away. Deputies combed the woods around the cabin, volunteers lined the logging road, and search dogs followed scents that dissolved in patches of melting snow. Every hour brought a new theory, a new call, a new reason to believe that someone had seen something they didn't realize was important at the time. By the end of the first month, that energy began to fade. Leads that had felt promising unraveled into loose threads. Witness statements contradicted one another. The weight of the unsolved disappearance settled over the town like late-season frost, numbing everyone who touched the case. Sheriff Henry Lowell kept a notebook of every tip and interview. The pages grew thicker with the pressure of his handwriting, the ink sinking deeper as the weeks dragged on. He carried the notebook everywhere, thumbing through it at the diner, rereading sections at home long after midnight. He told his deputies that somewhere in those pages lay the shape of the truth, but the shape remained elusive. The first major lead focused on a drifter who had been seen in Pine Hollow 2 days before the murders. He was a quiet man mid-30s who had purchased canned beans and a map from the general store. His boots were worn, patched with duct tape, and he had asked directions to the old fire road, something locals rarely used. When deputies finally located him 30 miles away, camping near a river, they questioned him for hours. He listened politely, nodded when asked about the Rowan family, and explained that he had left town before the night in question. His alibi held up. The tread on his boots matched nothing at the scene. He moved on again, leaving no more than a placeholder in the growing file of false suspects. The next lead came from the mill where the Rowan father worked. One of his co-workers claimed they had argued the week before about overtime hours. The co-worker, a man named Burton Rose, was known for temper flare-ups. Deputies interviewed him twice. His hands shook as he explained the disagreement had been routine, nothing serious. He didn't own a vehicle that matched the tracks found near the cabin. He had spent the night drinking with friends who confirmed his whereabouts. Despite that, rumors spread faster than facts. For a brief period, the town had nearly convinced itself that Rose had played a part in the attack. It took weeks for the tension to fall away, leaving only the lingering bitterness that suspicion had been aimed in the wrong direction. Reporters from regional newspapers arrived after the third week, knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, writing articles that carried more fear than substance. Headlines speculated on possible motives, hinting at hidden conflicts within the Rowan family. These suggestions devastated Mara's relatives, especially her aunt, who confronted one journalist outside the sheriff's office. Her voice cracked as she demanded the paper print a correction, but none came. The next morning, the family found a newspaper left under their windshield wiper, its front page asking whether the Rowan cabin had been targeted for reasons deeper than a random act. Inside the sheriff's department, morale dipped. Deputies disagreed on the priority of leads. One believed firmly that the tire tracks near the cabin belonged to a hunter who frequently drove the area at night. Another insisted they had been made by a truck with no current registration, possibly belonging to someone who knew the Rowan family. The sheriff tried to balance the competing theories, but every conversation returned to the same question: who would hurt a family like theirs? The search for Mara continued. Flyers bearing her school portrait were pinned to every store bulletin board in Silver Ridge County. Her red boots were mentioned in each description, though no one knew how important they would become. Of all the items from that night, the boot remained the object that tightened the throats of the investigators whenever they looked at the photograph from the crime scene. Its absence as a pair suggested movement, a struggle, a violent pull, details that could not be reconstructed with certainty. In early June, a hunter reported seeing a figure near the creek, carrying something heavy. He described the scene vaguely, admitting that evening light made it difficult to distinguish features. Deputies searched the area for 3 days. They found no clear tracks, only a torn piece of curtain caught on a bramble. The cloth was weathered from rain and sun. Though it resembled the fabric torn from the Rowan cabin window, the connection was never formally made. The evidence was bagged, logged, and placed in a drawer where it would remain untouched for years. By midsummer, the investigation had begun to buckle under its own weight. The sheriff called in assistance from the state police, hoping that fresh eyes might see what he and his deputies had missed. The state detectives reviewed every photograph, every statement, every scrap of evidence. They rebuilt timelines, read through maps, and returned to the cabin site with new methods. But time had eroded much of what might have been useful. Snowmelt had washed away prints. Rain had softened the edges of tire tracks. Animals had disturbed the soil around the cabin, scattering what little had remained. A state detective named Carlson summed up their frustration in a single sentence a week into the review. "We're looking at silhouettes," he said to the sheriff. "Shadows of what might have been." Carlson suggested interviewing former acquaintances of the Rowans, especially those who had recently left Pine Hollow. One name surfaced: Caleb Hart, a man who had worked briefly with the Rowan father before quitting the mill abruptly. Deputies interviewed neighbors who remembered Hart as a reclusive figure, someone who kept to himself and walked the woods at night. But Hart had left Pine Hollow shortly after the new year, months before the murder. No one had his forwarding address. There was no record of him committing any similar crimes. His name was written on a line in the sheriff's notebook and circled once, then abandoned as they moved to more urgent leads. Autumn brought new reports, none of substance. A family in a nearby county claimed to have seen a girl who resembled Mara at a truck stop. Deputies drove out to verify but found no evidence she had been there. Another tip pointed toward an abandoned shack miles from the Rowan cabin, where children sometimes dared each other to spend the night. Inside, deputies found only empty beer cans, a rusted stove, and carvings left by teenagers. By winter, the town's grief deepened. The forest road where the Rowan cabin stood felt heavier, as though memory itself clung to the pines. People walked faster when passing that stretch of woods. Some avoided it entirely, choosing longer routes home to bypass the uneasy quiet that seemed to emanate from the trees. Sheriff Lowell aged visibly in those months. His hair thinned, his voice roughened, and the lines around his eyes deepened from constant worry. He met often with the Rowan family, offering updates that grew increasingly hollow. During one meeting, Mara's aunt asked him, her voice trembling, whether they were any closer to finding her. Lowell looked down at his hands, unable to speak for several seconds. When he finally answered, his words felt rehearsed, fragile. "We're not giving up," he said, "but we need help." Time has not been kind to the evidence. The Rowan family left the office in silence, carrying a grief that settled into their posture. Years passed. Deputies came and went. A new sheriff was elected. Files were transferred to different shelves, boxes relabeled with cleaner handwriting but containing the same unresolved questions. Some detectives tried to revive the case, usually around anniversaries when renewed attention brought pressure. But each attempt followed the same path: initial hope, followed by a gradual dissolution of possibility. The red boot remained in evidence storage. At one point, in the early 90s, a technician suggested sending it for updated forensic testing, but the cost was too high and the county budget too thin. It was returned to its shelf, wrapped in aging plastic, the laces stiffening with time. New leads emerged occasionally, though each one collapsed under scrutiny. A man arrested for an unrelated assault claimed he had information about the Rowan case. When interviewed, he produced only vague stories and contradictions. Another tip suggested involvement by a transient group of workers who had passed through the region that spring. Investigators interviewed several members, but found no credible link to the crime. For the Rowan family, hope gradually transformed into something else, a quiet endurance. Daniel grew into adolescence under the long shadow of his sister's disappearance. He carried memories of the red boots, of her laughter, of the last walk home, like small stones he kept in his pocket. His life branched in ways shaped by that grief. Teachers noted his withdrawn nature. Neighbors said he stared into the woods too often, as though expecting someone to emerge and explain everything. By the late 90s, the Rowan case had become a whisper, a memory referenced during community gatherings, or cautionary tales told to younger generations. The sheriff's office still kept the file in a cabinet marked with unsolved cases, but the folder was rarely opened. When it was, dust rose gently from the surface, carrying the scent of paper turned brittle with age. A deputy once remarked to a colleague, "Some cases freeze so deep, you can't ever thaw them." His colleague nodded, eyes fixed on the closed file. "And some," he said, "were never meant to thaw." The official closure came quietly. Not a declaration, but an unspoken understanding. The Rowan case was moved to the cold case section, its label rewritten with cleaner ink. The boot, the torn curtain, the scraps of rope, the faded photographs, every artifact from that night remained where they were placed decades earlier. The final note added to the file in 2001 reads simply, "No further leads at this time." It was a sentence that carried the weight of defeat. And beneath it, in smaller handwriting, as if added by someone who could not quite give up, were 4 words that captured the truth more honestly than any official statement. Still waiting for her. The decades that followed did not pass all at once. They arrived in slow layers, the way snow builds overnight, quiet, steady, unannounced. For the Rowan family, those years became a long corridor where echoes of the past lingered on the walls. Grief did not leave. It only settled into the structure of their lives, reshaping the paths they walked, the choices they made, the silences they shared. The cabin was torn down within a year of the murders, its wood repurposed or burned, its foundation left behind as a faint rectangle in the soil. For a long time, Daniel avoided the area, unable to bear the thought of stepping where laughter had once lived. But as he entered his late teens, something within him shifted. He began walking the old logging road again, tracing the route he and Mara had taken home from school. He knew exactly where her footprints had once fallen, even though the snow and earth had erased them long ago. He imagined her stepping ahead of him, red boots punching small, distinct impressions into the slush. He kept one photograph of her in his wallet. It was a school portrait, the same one used on the missing person flyers. The edges of the picture softened with years of handling, the colors fading into pastel shades. Each time he opened the wallet, whether to buy groceries or pay a mechanic, he saw her face looking up, frozen at 13. He found that he couldn't remove the picture even if he wanted to. It felt like the last piece of her that remained within reach. Their relatives coped in different ways. Mara's mother moved to a smaller town 2 hours south. The grief had tightened her bones, leaving her shoulders perpetually hunched. She worked in a convenience store for many years, her hands trembling slightly when she counted change. She rarely spoke about the cabin, but she kept a box in her closet filled with objects from their old life, a knitted scarf, a broken toy, a handful of drawings Mara had scattered throughout her room. Sometimes she took the box out, rested her palms on the lid, and left it unopened. Touching it felt like touching a scar. Her father drifted from job to job. The mill closed not long after the murders, and he tried forestry work, construction, seasonal maintenance. People said he aged faster than the others, not from the labor, but from the ache of something unfinished. By the time he reached 50, His hair had lost its color, and his smile, once broad, had narrowed into a faint curl of politeness. He and Mara's mother hardly spoke, not out of anger, but from exhaustion. Grief had turned them into distant planets orbiting the same silent memory. Every April, the family held a small vigil near the place where the cabin once stood. At first, neighbors joined them, sometimes bringing candles, sometimes nothing but presents. Children from town placed stones around the site, stacking them in small cairns as a gesture of remembrance. But as the years stretched, the crowd thinned. Familiar faces moved away. New families arrived who had only heard the story in fragments. The vigil became a small gathering of those who remembered, or those who felt obligated by the weight of the past. Daniel attended each year. When he turned 21, he joined the local Forest Service, partly because he loved the woods, and partly because he couldn't leave the place where Mara had vanished. He said the forest felt different to him, tense with echoes. Working among the pines, he found a strange peace in the quiet spaces where wind sifted through branches, carrying the scent of sap and the promise of memory. Some days he believed that if he listened long enough, he might hear her footsteps again. Journalists called occasionally during anniversaries. Most wanted to ask about the red boot, the torn curtain, or the rumors that lingered in Pine Hollow long after the case stalled. A reporter from Helena interviewed Daniel when he was 26. She asked him what he remembered most from the day before Mara disappeared. He paused for a long time, then answered that he remembered her tightening her lace with a quick tug near the bend in the road. She always tied them tight, he said. She used to say the boots helped her find her way. The reporter wrote her article with care, quoting him sparingly. Yet when the story was published, Daniel felt hollow. It was as if retelling the memory had drained something from him. He vowed not to give another interview. As the 90s unfolded, the Rowan case took on a ghostly life of its own in Montana folklore. Teenagers dared one another to walk the forest road at night, whispering about the red boot left behind. Teachers used the story as a warning about wandering too far or trusting strangers. At the diner, the older folks spoke of the case in softer tones, glancing around as if the woods themselves might be listening. But despite the myth-making, the actual investigation remained dormant. Files rusted in drawers, photos curled at the edges, evidence bags yellowed with age. The sheriff's office saw turnovers. New deputies inherited the case file and opened it out of curiosity, only to close it again when they saw how little could be done with deteriorated notes and outdated methods. Through all of this, Daniel's life continued in uneven lines. He married at 31, though the marriage dissolved within a few years. His wife had loved him, but she admitted that she never felt like she had all of him. There was a part of him always elsewhere, walking a forest trail, standing at a creek, staring down the road where his sister had vanished. He returned to Pine Hollow after the divorce, moving into a small cabin not far from where he had grown up. His mother visited occasionally. His father, older now and softened by the years, sometimes drove north to spend the day with him. They rarely spoke of Mara directly, but sometimes Daniel caught his father staring into the trees as though searching for a shape he had known long ago. Early in the 2000s, digital archives became more common. A young deputy scanned the Rowan files as part of a modernization project. While doing so, he noticed a photograph he had never seen referenced in the physical folder. It showed the red boot from a slightly different angle, the eyelets visible, the left lace pulled through with the sharp tension of force. He printed the image and placed it on top of the file. For several days, the sight of the boot unsettled him. He brought it to the sheriff's attention, but the sheriff told him that until scientific tools advanced further, the photo could not reveal more than it already had. So the file remained in its drawer. The passing years did not dull the family's pain, but they did change its shape. Grief became quieter, more private, less of a wound and more of a shadow. Still, every April, Daniel walked to the old cabin site and left something behind: a pinnacone, a ribbon, a small stone. These offerings served no practical purpose. They simply marked time, acknowledging the absence that had shaped his life more profoundly than any presence. One autumn, near the end of the decade, a letter arrived from a stranger who had read about the case online. The letter was handwritten, shaky in its penmanship. The writer claimed to have known someone who resembled a suspect briefly mentioned in an article. The sheriff's office glanced at the letter and set it aside. They received dozens of similar letters each year. But Daniel read it differently. Something about the way the writer described the man made Daniel's heartbeat quicken. It wasn't a lead exactly, but a reminder. Someone out there still remembered enough to write. It was around this time that talk of new forensic technology began to surface in crime documentaries. Cold cases solved through DNA. Families reunited with answers decades later. Daniel watched these stories late at night, listening to scientists explain how cells preserved for years could still speak. He wondered if anything from the cabin, his sister's boot, the curtain, the rope fragment, might hold the same potential. He wrote a letter to the county in 2016. It was simple. A single page, asking whether the Rowan evidence might be re-examined using new methods. He didn't expect a reply. The letter had been a way of releasing something he'd held tight for too long. But weeks later, he received a call from a newly assigned cold case detective. She asked him to come in when he had time. When he arrived, the detective greeted him with a quiet seriousness. She placed an old file on the table between them. He recognized the case number immediately. She explained that the department had formed a small task force to review unsolved cases with viable evidence. "We're starting with items that might still contain trace material," she said. "Your sister's boot was stored better than most. There's a chance it contains something that earlier investigators couldn't find." Daniel sat very still. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were trembling. For the first time in decades, hope flickered, not as a warm, bright thing, but as a thin line of light under a long closed door. "And if it does?" he asked. "Then we follow wherever it leads." He left the sheriff's office feeling the weight of the years around him, but something inside had changed. The forest felt different that evening. The air held a quiet vibration. The trees seemed to lean closer as though listening. He walked toward the old road, the one where Mara's footprints had once marked the slush. For the first time in a long time, he imagined not just the past but the possibility of an ending. Hope did not come loudly. It arrived the way it always had in Pine Hollow, softly, almost imperceptibly. But it arrived. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop an emoji in the comments. The Cold Case Task Force began with little more than a list of forgotten files and the determination of people who had not grown up in Pine Hollow, people who saw the Rowan case not as a town wound but as an unsolved equation. Detective Elise Warren was one of them. When she sat at her desk in early 2019, the Rowan file sat open before her like a long, unfinished sentence. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old glue. The photographs, curled at the edges, carried the muted tones of another era. Her eyes kept returning to one image, the red winter boot lying on its side near the cracked window, its laces drawn tight, its shape almost pleading for attention. She knew the story well by then. 3 lives lost, 1 child taken, no resolution. What surprised her most was how meticulously the evidence had been preserved despite early mishandling. The boot in particular had been sealed in plastic, rebagged, and shelved multiple times. Yet something about its condition gave her pause. The stitching was intact, the interior darkened with decades of stored air. If any object could have held a trace that survived the years, it would be this one. She called the State Forensic Lab and asked to meet with Dr. Kira Rand, a scientist known for her work with ultra-low template DNA. When Elise arrived, she brought only the boot and a copy of the chain of custody logs. Kira studied the object through the clear plastic, like someone evaluating a relic unearthed from quiet soil. "You said this has never been tested with modern methods," Kira said. "Not with anything more advanced than surface swabs. Those were done in the 90s. Then whatever survived will be inside," Kira replied. Places no one touched. Places no one even thought to look. Elise nodded. She placed the boot gently on the examination table. It looked smaller outside evidence storage, almost childlike, more vulnerable. The red leather was darker than in the photograph, stiff with age. The lace had a small knot at one end, pulled too tight to unravel without breaking it. "This might be the only voice she has left," Elise said quietly. Kira looked at her with a solemn kind of agreement. Then she began. The initial examination was slow, deliberate. Light swept across the leather. The boot was rotated, angled, studied beneath magnification. Elise watched from behind a contamination barrier, trying not to breathe too loudly. It was strange how something so familiar to the case could feel new under the lab lights. The object that had haunted Pine Hollow for decades now seemed to awaken, its details gaining clarity. Inside the boot, near the lace channel stitching, Kira discovered what she had hoped for: microscopic traces in protected pockets that had escaped earlier handling. She used micro swabs thin as needles, collecting samples no larger than dust motes. The material was deposited into vials, each one fragile and uncertain. The next step was quantification. Samples were placed into a machine that whispered soft readings across a screen. The numbers appeared low: 0.012 nanograms, then 0.009, then 0.003, but consistent. "That's enough," Kira said. Barely, but enough. The extraction stage took hours. It was night by the time Kira prepared the samples for sequencing. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the parking lot. The world seemed to fold inward, as if bracing itself. When the first genetic markers appeared on the screen, they looked like faint coordinates on a map. Elise leaned closer, recognizing the significance long before the full pattern emerged. The partial profile belonged to a male. The degradation was substantial, but the markers that survived could be aligned. Kira continued adjusting the settings, filtering out contaminants, running comparisons. The second reading strengthened the profile. The third confirmed it. "This is real," Elise whispered. "It survived in the lace channel," Kira said. "Protected all these years." Once the sequence stabilized, Kira prepared the file for genealogical analysis. She explained that the profile wasn't complete enough for a direct match in national databases, but it held enough viable points to search for biological relatives. The algorithm began to build a family tree through inference matching small, overlapping fragments of shared DNA from public and law enforcement genealogical networks. The first cluster appeared as expected, distant cousins 2 to 4 generations removed. The next cluster was closer, arranged around a surname deeply rooted in Montana. Hart. Elise felt her pulse climb. The name was familiar from Sheriff Lowell's old notes. A man who lived on the same logging road. A man who quit the mill abruptly. A man who had left Pine Hollow before the murders, but whose timeline had always been uncertain. As the genealogical branches tightened, another match surfaced closer than the rest. A near direct relative. Someone alive. Someone who shared half the genome with the person who had left trace DNA in the lace of Mara's boot. "That's a child of the source," Kira said softly. Elise stared at the screen. A son? Or daughter? But the markers suggest a son. The program identified him by name, a man living in the town of Cold Ridge, barely 40 miles away. Middle-aged with a clean record, married, children. A long life constructed quietly, without suspicion. Elise and her team made discreet inquiries, pulling records, tracking addresses. The man had been born shortly after the Rowan murders. His father had never been listed. His mother had died in the early 90s. There were no public documents naming the father. But the genetic link was irrefutable. The task force traced the mother's acquaintances and discovered that during the spring of 1984, she had briefly lived near Pine Hollow. She had worked at a diner off the highway where many mill workers stopped to eat. Among her co-workers was a man in his late 20s named Caleb Hart. The connection grew clearer. A search through employment archives revealed that Hart had quit the mill after a heated confrontation with a supervisor. He left Pine Hollow abruptly, moving through several towns before disappearing into a quiet life elsewhere under his own name. There was nothing dramatic about his record, no arrests, no violence reported. He had simply stepped out of one life and into another, leaving behind the traces of a crime no one suspected him of. When the warrant was approved, Elise and 2 detectives drove to Cold Ridge. The road wound through frozen fields and dark timber stands. As they approached the house, they noticed its plainness. A small home with a porch swing, a dog bowl near the steps, a wind chime gently moving in the breeze. It was the kind of place where children played on weekends and families gathered for holidays. Elise knocked. A man in his 60s answered, gray-haired, soft around the edges, the kind of quiet man who blended into a crowd. She introduced herself, stating her department and the case she represented. The shift in his expression was immediate. His eyes flickered, a small involuntary flash of recognition. "Caleb Hart," Elise said. "We need to speak with you." He froze, the door halfway open. The quiet of the evening seemed to thicken. His shoulders lowered, not in surrender, but in something closer to inevitability, as if the weight he had carried for decades had finally grown too heavy. When the cuffs closed around his wrists, he did not protest. He glanced once toward the porch, then toward the horizon, where the sky had begun to tint with evening light. "Tell her brother," he said quietly, "that it wasn't supposed to happen like that." Elise said nothing. There was nothing to say. News of the arrest traveled quickly through Pine Hollow. People who had grown up hearing the Rowan story felt a mixture of shock and relief. Some were angry that a man who had once lived among them had walked free for so long. Others were stunned by the quiet banality of the suspect's life. But most found themselves returning to the same thought. The boot had remembered what no one else could. Daniel received the call from Elise on a cold morning. He listened without speaking, the wind rustling around him as he stood among the pines. When she finished, he closed his eyes. A tremor passed through him, not grief, not joy, but release. "So it's true," he said. "After all this time, it's true," she replied. He let the silence settle between them. Not the heavy silence of loss, but something lighter like snow falling softly over a clearing. "Thank you," he finally said. That night, Daniel walked to the old cabin site. Stars hung low over the valley. The forest felt different, as if a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. He placed a small stone at the edge of the clearing and whispered his sister's name into the cold air. For the first time, it did not feel like a plea. It felt like an answer. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. Caleb Hart was led into the county jail under a pale morning sky, his wrists bound, his posture stooped as if he had already spent years carrying the weight of what he'd done. The officers around him moved quietly. There was no triumph in their steps, only a solemn understanding that justice, when it finally arrived, often felt like a shadow of the moment it should have been. He did not resist. He did not ask questions. He simply walked, eyes lowered, as though the world around him had long stopped belonging to him. Detective Elise Warren stood behind the glass partition later that day, watching him sit in the interview room. He folded his hands neatly on the table, a gesture that felt practiced, almost courteous. His face carried the aging softness of a man who'd spent years blending into the background of ordinary life. But his eyes held something else, an emptiness that made Elise feel as though she was staring at a person who had stepped out of time. She entered the room with a folder under her arm, though the folder mattered far less than the truth she already carried. When she sat across from him, the chair gave a small creak, and that sound alone seemed to break whatever silence Hart had adopted as protection. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. He nodded once. "Your people said it was about the Rowan girl." "About all of them," she said. "About that night." His eyes flickered toward the wall, as though memory lived somewhere beyond it. "I thought it would stay buried," he said. "I didn't think anyone would look that deeply." "Science did," Elise answered. She placed the red boot on the table, carefully, respectfully. Its presence in the room felt heavier than any accusation. Hart's gaze settled on it, and a faint tremble appeared in his jaw. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The boot seemed to occupy the space between them like a living witness. When he finally inhaled, it was shallow and strained. "I never meant to take her," he said. "It wasn't supposed to happen the way it did." His words were not a confession of detail. Not yet, but they were enough. Elise kept her voice steady, offering no anger, no sympathy. "Only space. Tell me what happened." His answer came in fragments. The job at the mill, the resentment, the fight with the Rowan father, the drinking, the drive down the logging road, the belief that no one inside the cabin could stop him. And then the moment when everything shattered, when the family resisted, when panic took over, when he grabbed what he could and fled into the dark. He spoke of dragging Mara through the broken window, though he claimed her injuries had not been intentional. He described the way her boot had slipped off, how he had not noticed until he was halfway down the slope behind the cabin. He said he had carried her because she wasn't conscious, though Elise could not tell whether that was truth or revision. His words blurred between confession and self-preservation, a mixture common to men who had lived decades pretending the past was survivable. When he finished, he rested his hands flat on the table, his knuckles colorless. "I didn't think they would find anything," he said. "Not after so long." "They didn't," Elise replied. "The boot did." He closed his eyes. "She tried to tie it tighter before He stopped. The sentence broke under its own weight. A week later, Hart was formally charged. Word spread through Pine Hollow with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Some residents cried. Some felt guilty for having suspected the wrong people all those years. Others said nothing, carrying the news like a stone inside their chest. The courthouse was a modest building with narrow windows and wooden benches that creaked under every shift of weight. On the morning of Hart's preliminary hearing, the light filtered through the clouds in muted tones, giving the corridor an almost washed-out glow. People from the community gathered, older faces who remembered the Rowan children, younger ones who had grown up hearing bits of the story whispered after dark. Daniel Rowan sat near the back of the courtroom. He looked older than his years, the kind of aging shaped by loss rather than time. His hands rested in his lap, steady but tense. He did not look at Hart when the deputies escorted him into the room. Instead, he stared forward, eyes fixed on the judge's desk as if anchoring himself to something solid. The proceedings moved slowly. Hart's attorney spoke in controlled tones about decades-old evidence, about memory degradation, about the uncertainty of confessions given under pressure. But when the prosecution presented the genetic genealogical findings, the room shifted. The explanation was clinical, but the implications were impossible to ignore. The descendant match, the family cluster, the narrowing of the lineage until one name remained. Hart watched the presentation without blinking, as though he had already resigned himself to the unavoidable truth. Then the red boot was brought forward carefully, solemnly. The courtroom fell still, and Daniel felt his breath catch. The object looked impossibly small behind the glass display case, smaller even than the memory he had carried since childhood. It felt unreal that something so small could hold so much grief, so much evidence, so much silence. The jury was shown the photographs, the boot at the crime scene, the lace pulled tight, the angle of its placement. Then they saw the lab images, the sequencing charts, the mitochondrial reads, the overlays of genetic relatives. The science was meticulous, the explanation precise. When the analyst finished speaking, there was nothing left for the defense but quiet. The trial stretched over several days. Witnesses from long ago were brought in, some trembling with age, some clear in their recollections. Former deputies testified about the early investigation, their voices carrying the weight of regret. Hart did not speak again, and by the time closing arguments were delivered, He looked like a man who had slipped into the shadow of his own story. When the jury returned, the verdict was read in a single heavy breath. Guilty on all counts. The silence that followed felt different from the silence of the forest or the silence of unsolved years. This was a silence that closed something, a silence that settled the air rather than suspended it. Hart lowered his head. He did not cry. He did not protest. He simply exhaled, as though finally releasing what he had carried for too long. Daniel remained seated, unable to move. The verdict did not bring joy. It did not bring relief. It brought something quieter, something deeper, a sense that the story that had shaped his entire life had finally reached a place where it could stop growing. After the courtroom emptied, Elise found him standing near the hallway window, looking out at the pale afternoon. "It's done," she said. He nodded, but did not look away from the glass. "It doesn't change what happened," he said, "but it changes how I carry it." She understood. Some truths arrived too late to feel like victories, but they still mattered. They created space for breath where breath had once been held tight. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. Inside was a sketch one of Mara's drawings he had kept since childhood. A pine branch, imperfect, erased and redrawn in places. He held it gently, smoothing the creases. "She should have grown up," he said. "She should have had more than memories." Elise didn't respond. There was nothing she could add. As they stood together, the courthouse lights dimming behind them, Daniel whispered his sister's name. It did not echo. It simply settled into the quiet, accepted at last by a world that had finally heard her story. Outside, the sky had begun to clear. A faint beam of sunlight stretched across the pavement, thin but steady, as if marking the path forward. Justice had arrived not as thunder, not as triumph, but as a long-delayed exhale. Hit the like button if you believe justice always finds its way. In the months that followed the verdict, Pine Hollow settled into a quieter rhythm. Not the heavy quiet of a town haunted by uncertainty, but a gentler one, shaped by the knowledge that the long unanswered question had finally found its voice. People walked the logging road again without quickening their pace. The Rowan cabin site, once avoided, became a place where visitors paused rather than fled, leaving small stones or pine branches as quiet gestures of respect. Daniel carried himself differently. The years still lived in his posture, but something in him had softened, the tightening around his eyes, the way he held his breath in long pauses, the bracing against memories that once rose like storms. He knew justice had come late, too late to return the life that had been taken. But he also understood that late truth still mattered. It reshaped the landscape inside him. It let some of the shadows break apart. He returned off into the clearing where the cabin once stood. Snowmote glimmered along the edges of the stones he had placed over the years. On one visit, he knelt and brushed aside a patch of needles near the tree line, revealing a small fragment of weathered leather, just the faint edge of something the forest had claimed long ago. It wasn't Mara's boot. It wasn't evidence. It was simply a reminder that the world holds on to pieces of us in unexpected ways. He placed it gently beside the cairn of stones and let the wind cover it again. Detective Elise Warren visited Pine Hollow once more that spring. She and Daniel walked the road together, talking not about the trial but about the forest, the seasons, the strange ways time changes its weight when pain is finally allowed to rest. She told him the case would be used as an example in training programs, how persistence, even across decades, could reveal answers no one imagined were still reachable. He listened, nodding lightly. "It's not just the answers," he said. "It's knowing she wasn't lost in silence. That someone heard her." The town began restoring records of its history, adding a small plaque near the old cabin site. It didn't mention the violence. It didn't mention Hart. It simply read, "In memory of those we loved, and the truth that found its way home." People said the words felt right clean, unburdened by darkness, pointed toward what mattered most. Spring arrived with soft rain and new growth. The pines lifted their green tips, and the creek ran clearer than it had in years. Life, in its steady way, continued. And yet, whenever the wind passed through the branches, it carried something like remembrance, not sharp, not painful, but warm and settled. One evening, Daniel stood on the ridge above the town, watching the sky shift from gold to blue. He held the sketch he had carried since childhood, the pine branch drawn by Mara's unsteady hand. He no longer kept it folded away. Instead, he let the paper breathe in the open air. He imagined her beside him, older, smiling at the view she never had the chance to reach. For the first time, the thought did not hurt. It simply existed, soft and peaceful. When he started down the trail, the light fell in long strands across the path, catching the frost in scattered glints. One spark of light landed on the red boot he had placed at the memorial years ago, the restored boot, cleaned and preserved, returned not as evidence but as a symbol. It stood there quietly, no longer a question, no longer a plea. Just a piece of memory resting where it belonged. As he walked away, the forest behind him felt lighter, as if something long held had finally been released. Which case should we tell next? Leave your suggestion below.